In 1965, Dodge came out with a car that was the perfect compromise. This 1965 Coronet could be anything you wanted it to be. Hi there, Rick DeBrule here with another chapter in the automotive evolution. Once again, I'm here at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. You know, this is a great collection. More than 180 cars, some very stock, some very custom, and some resto-modded, like this 1965 Dodge Coronet 440. 1965 marked both the return of the Coronet name and the beginning of Dodge's next generation intermediate offerings. This car was built to compete against the Chevelle and, of course, the Ford Fairlane. Some people wanted just a family car, but other people, well, they wanted performance. And Dodge figured out a way to cater to both crowds and everyone in between. But before we talk too much about this car, make sure you like and subscribe. And in the comments down below, let me know what I got right and, of course, what I got wrong. There's always something I get wrong. And tell me your Dodge Coronet stories. Did you have a sedate family version, or was yours a little more performance? Were you strictly a Mopar clan? All right, now, before we talk too much about this car right here, it's time for a little Coronet history. In British royalty, a coronet is a kind of a crown, but it's not the crown worn by a king or a queen. You know, nice, but not over the top. You know, something for a prince or a princess. In Dodge royalty, the Coronet name was used first in 1949. It was the top Dodge available back then. By the late 1950s, the Coronet had become the entry-level Dodge, a lesser nobleman sold alongside the Royal and the Custom Royal. And then the Coronet name disappeared. But in 1965, Dodge brought the Coronet name back, anointing their brand new intermediate car with a touch of royalty by giving it that Coronet name. Now, this was officially launched on September 17, 1964, had a 117-inch wheelbase and a variety of body styles. You know, there was two-door, four-door, wagons, convertibles. I think there were 17 in total. But this wasn't Dodge's first intermediate. That was the Polara. As the story goes, Chrysler panicked in the early 60s, thinking GM was going to start downsizing their big cars, so they went small as well. Turns out that didn't happen over at Chevy, which left Chrysler struggling in the full-size market. So for 65, they opted for the three-category system that Ford and Chevy were using: a compact like the Dart, an intermediate, and a full-size car like the new Polara. And the Coronet, well, it became the mid-sized offering. Like Chevy and Ford's mid-sized offerings, Dodge also offered a wide range of performance and style with their new Coronet. In fact, there was an A990 version that was available that was actually a race-ready dragster. Only about 100 or so of those were made, and we just happen to have one right here at the museum. But that's a different video that I've already done. Well, let's walk around and take a look at the styling on our 1965 Dodge Coronet. And it's important to point out this was essentially a one-year body style. For 1966, they would make some pretty significant changes in the styling of this. They would go to a much sharper look. For 1965, I call this a softer look, a little more rounded. You can see this element right here that kind of comes up. If you were to look at a Polara or a Custom 880 from 1965, it has flatter sides, sharper lines. And that's exactly what they decided to go to in 1966 when they changed the body style just a little bit so it would have a little more updated look. It's important to point out that this car has dual headlights, and while that seems pretty obvious for 1965, the Dodge Dart only had a single headlight, so this was to make it clear that this was a step up. Here we have the 440 designation. You could get three different cars. You could get the Coronet base, the 440, or you could get the 500. And by the way, this 400 has nothing to do with what's underneath the hood. The next year, 440 would be an engine designation. For right now, it was really just a name that they put on the car. They wanted to have a name that they could use, and 440 was below 500, which was their top of the line. I'm not sure where they came up with it, but that's the name that they were using. You'll see we've got Krager SS mags. Those are great period correct additions because a lot of people who were hot rodding cars back then would have exactly that. This has a 117-inch wheelbase, which was slightly longer than both the Chevelle and the Ford Fairlane. It was significantly longer than the Dodge Dart, which had a 111-inch wheelbase, and of course shorter than their full-sized offerings, which would have been the 121-inch wheelbase that would have been available back then. I love the design element right here with this hardtop look, with this little triangle-shaped element, the crease that comes across the top. Not everybody likes this, but it is an interesting kind of styling touch, almost kind of a convertible-ish kind of look. As you go to the back of the car, I believe you only got the backup lights if you got the 440 model or above. If you got the base version, you were not able to get that. Dodge touted the fact that you had oceans of usable luggage space back there, and with very good reason. I mean, look at the overhang on the back of this car. From the center line of the rear wheels all the way back to the back of the car, I think is 53 inches. So there was plenty of room, plenty of weight in the back that was tail heavy, but also plenty of room if you wanted to haul something around. We'll go inside in just a moment. As I mentioned, this was the 440, the mid-range. If you got a 500, you actually got three elements right here that almost looked like, Buick Ventaports almost, that were added as style touches to show that there was a slight distinction between the 440 and the 500. Overall, though, great looking car, mid-sized, just a little bigger than the competition. Underneath the hood of our 1965 Coronet here at the museum is what I'll call a period upgrade. It has a 426 cubic inch Hemi that looks like it might have the setup from a 66 or 67 Dodge. It's got those inline 4-barrel carburetors. That, together with some other upgrades like this aluminum radiator, are what makes me call this a resto mod. Mostly stock, except for the wheels on the outside, but something much more potent underneath the hood. Now, back in 1965, the Coronet series offered a wide range of engines. Standard was the Slant 6, but if you were in the mood for a V8, well, there was a 273 cubic inch with 180 horsepower, a 318 that bumped that up to 230, the 361 went to 265, and 383 was pretty stout with 330 horsepower, but then there was a 413 with 10 more than that. And if that wasn't enough for you, well, you had some 426 cubic inch options. A street wedge that made 365 horsepower. Now, that 426 street wedge was a $444 option, and I've seen numbers that say about 2,100 of those were sold. By the way, I love what Dodge said about the street wedge in the brochure. Handle with care. It leaves nothing to the imagination. All right, this is a bit of a mystery to me, though. There was also a 426 cubic inch Hemi, and I don't know if or how many of those Hemis were sold in a Coronet for what are beyond the A990 super stock cars, which were really built just for drag racing. The only notes I've seen said the Hemi was available, but that Chrysler sold them as is, meaning they got no warranty, and it cost $1,800 and it was sold over the counter. So help me out. Do you know if any Hemis were sold in 1965 street Coronets, not the A990 cars? Were they factory installed or just shipped to the dealer? By the way, the only thing the VIN tells us about this car is that it was delivered with a V8. We just don't know which one. But really the main point of all those options is that Coronet could be anything you wanted it to be. A simple mid-sized car or a potent street racer built to challenge those Chevy super stocks. Now, let's step into our 1965 Dodge Coronet and check out the Dodge midsize world for that year. It's important to point out that, as I mentioned in the walk-around, this car has a 117-inch wheelbase, and it was slightly longer than both the Chevelle and the Ford Fairlane. And Dodge made that a big selling point when they were advertising this car. They talked about the fact that it had more legroom and more hip room than the competition, which you think about, if you were slightly larger, that's exactly what you were going to want. They also bragged that they had a better dash setup, their instruments. Instead of just having warning lights, they had a temperature gauge and an alternator gauge up front. It was something that the other competition didn't have. Now, here in our resto mod, as you can see, we have a tachometer that's been put in, big aftermarket thing. We also have an aftermarket oil and water gauge down here. You can see how they've been put in there. I do have to say that I think that the dash layout is just a bit awkward because they've got this rectangular box with the horizontal speedometer inside, but then it's kind of angled up above with the Brightwork, the aluminum piece that goes beyond it. So seems a little awkward, but once again, apparently they liked it, so I'm not going to argue too much about it. In the back seat, decent enough room. I mean, if you're 6'5", you probably wouldn't be comfortable, but would you ever be comfortable in the back seat of a car? This was a mid-size car. It wasn't a full size, so there was enough room in the back, for probably what you were going to do. $2,200 was the base price if you were going to get just your basic Dodge Coronet. Went all the way up to $2,800 if you were getting the 500, and that was before you added on any options. You know, things, for example, like power steering, that was going to cost, I think, about $70 or so. If you wanted power brakes, that was going to cost about $33. But Dodge did make a big point of talking about the fact that their brake shoes were bigger than what you were going to get on either a Chevelle or a Ford Fairlane. So even if you didn't go for the power brakes, you still were going to get more stopping power. If you did opt for the 440 over the base, there were a couple things you got that were really important. Number one, you got carpeting, which was really nice. And number two, you got something called an air foam seat. So it was just a little bit more comfortable. And of course, you got a little tiny Coronet 440 emblem right here. So you knew every time you got into the car that you had something that was just a little bit better. It's comfortable enough, once again, big enough. So I think for what they were going for in 1965, they were really achieving their goal. And as I mentioned, trying to be all things to all people, you know, what do you want? You want an automatic, you want a 3-speed, or you want a 4-speed. Not quite this fancy, but there was a 4-speed that was available. Interesting, I should point out, if you got the station wagon, they also made a 3-row station wagon. Now, those were usually reserved for the big station wagons, the full size. But in their mid-size car, this Coronet, you could get a 3-row intermediate station wagon. And if you got that 3-row, you couldn't get the 6-cylinder. They made sure you got a V8 in that one. The Coronet was a solid success. You know, Dodge sold just over 550,000 cars in 1965, and the biggest share was the 209,000 Coronets they sold. As I mentioned, the Coronet did get a facelift in '66, but underneath it was still basically the same. It would get another update in '68 and have more performance options over the next few years. In fact, don't forget, the Super Bee was based on the Coronet. The next big change came in 1971. They gave it a restyle that tried to make it look, shall we say, a little more grown up. That generation ran through '74. A new Coronet introduced in '75, but it was not enough to stop sagging sales. '76 was the last year for the Coronet name, when they sold just over 30,000. The next year, they simply renamed the car the Monaco, sort of another nod to royalty. But back in 1965, when this Coronet was sold, it may not have been regal, but its sales were princely. And a lot of that, no doubt, due to the fact that this car could be whatever you wanted it to be.